Yeah, yes, we're ready.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You see, we have 3 centers connected. We have 4 of us here in Cape Town. I see there's a larger crowd in Pretoria, and we have 1 person joining us in Durban. Thank you for coming through. My name is Krish Chetty. I'm a researcher within the BRICS Research Center. Today we are hosting Dr. Ubuntu Suisa, who is going to talk to us about some of the work that he submitted to the BRICS Academic Forum earlier this year in May. This is the first of a new series of BRICS seminars that we are holding. This seminar is now being held in conjunction with the new hosts of the South African BRICS think tank, who are the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. So you would actually see on the invite that we have both logos actually on this, because this is a new initiative that we are beginning, and we are therefore partnering with the new hosts of the SA BRICS think tank. What you might have also heard is that we are streaming this event live, so although we might not have a large crowd with us today in the room, we actually do have people following us online, and we welcome them as well. For the viewers online, you are able to submit questions to @HSRC_BRC. That's the HSRC BRICS Research Center Twitter handle. So we shall try and receive questions from there and then answer those later today. So thank you everybody for coming through. As I mentioned, we are very honored today to host Dr. Ubuntu Suisa. His profile reads as such: Dr. Suisa has published on BRICS peace and security challenges, Africa's peace and security challenges in the context of BRICS, in papers of the 5th BRICS Academic Forum, BRICS and Africa, Partnership for Development, Integration and Industrialization, Municipal Service Delivery and Social Movements in the Journal of South African Studies, and published a chapter in the subject in Development Dilemmas in Post-Apartheid South Africa. This was taken from his thesis for his PhD, titled People's Water, Water Services Struggles and the New Social Movements in Mpumalanga, Durban. Dr. Suisa has also published in Humanitas on the state of post-apartheid South Africa's educational system, and in Accords magazine outlet on Nelson Mandela's legacy. Dr. Suisa is experienced in a broad range of areas in applied social sciences, comprehensive research utilizing open, gray, and covert sources, fieldwork research on conflict resolution, peace building, municipal service delivery, social movements, local economic development, quantitative and qualitative research analysis, and report writing. Dr. Suisa is a Rhodes Scholar and a 2012 Tutu Leadership Fellow, has earned his BA, Honours, and Masters from the UKZN, and has worked as a senior lecturer in politics and is a leader in the master's program in South African politics and political economy at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. He is also a research associate at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, a senior researcher for the South African government's foreign diplomacy initiatives on Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, and as a senior researcher and manager in the non-governmental sector. Currently, Dr. Suisa is consulting independently on BRICS peace and security matters, international relations, conflict and post-conflict research and analysis, and on local government and municipal services delivery. So we are very honored to have you today. The title of Dr. Suisa's presentation is on BRICS at 7, Finding and Funding the Nexus Between Peace, Security and Development in Africa. Thank you for joining us. Please, Dr. Suisa, I hand over to you.
Colleagues in Durban and Cape Town, can you see the slide?
Yes, Moses.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues in Pretoria, in Durban, and in Cape Town. I would like to stress right from the beginning that this is a process that we get together to think out loud, because we are confronted with a tabula rasa experience. Tabula rasa experience in the sense that we have the Development Bank, in particular the New Development Bank Africa Regional Center, and this is a new phenomenon and a new institution amongst us. And as South Africa and as South Africans, we have to get together to think aloud as to which forms of expressions is the New Development Bank going to form, and particularly within the context of peace and security challenges in Africa. And so in that vein, this presentation is then a step at a functionalist approach in assessing how BRICS can approach its developmental mandate within the realm of the current order of international relations. So it's therefore a vigorously deliberate shift from the traditional discourse on critiquing and the legitimacy and the credibility of BRICS to moving away to highlighting how BRICS can function, what BRICS is capable of doing, with who, and how, and at what levels. And so this need for the shift of discourse becomes more apparent and more required when we realize that the institutionalization process within BRICS is crystallizing, it's gaining momentum, and it's therefore a realization that BRICS is not an institution of over-enthusiastic leaders and stakeholders from the global south that can be wished away. You know, it is there, particularly at 7 years old, when we realize that it's institutionalizing itself right at a time when the dominant Eurozone is changing gear, and perhaps changing gear permanently so. And this institutionalization process, the consolidation of the institutionalization process within BRICS, has become most manifest with the establishment of the New Development Bank. And so it is incumbent upon us then to find ways of thinking about how the New Development Bank should function, because the New Development Bank is coming into a continuum of history of other multilateral banks from the global south that have staked their claims in executing sustainable development. And so it is then incumbent upon us to think about how the New Development Bank should approach thinking, particularly within the realm of peace and security challenges, but how it can do that not from the tail end of conflict, as it is usually thought of, but during the mess of conflict, whether it is sleeping conflict or dormant conflict. And so this is what I thought of that perhaps could be an introduction, could be a contribution that I can make, and also a contribution that I can invite people to make into really thinking on how the New Development Bank African Regional Center can stake its claim on peace and security challenges, generate sustainable development opportunities and sustainable development thinking from these peace and security challenges, and as I've pointed out before, do so not from the tail end of conflict as it has been traditionally done, but during the mess, during the continuation, during the as conflict proceeds. And so then that would be perhaps a novel way of getting to think how the New Development Bank, amongst other multilateral banks from the global south, can proceed in generating sustainable development opportunities from these challenges. And so these are the outline areas of my presentation. And so I think it's important at this stage to first have an appraisal of what BRICS is at 7 years old. And as I've pointed out before, there is a shift of discourse on BRICS to think more of how BRICS can function the practical functionality of BRICS and practical functionality of BRICS, which should be imparted on its development vehicles. And secondly, that BRICS countries, they've always stated that they coalesce on one shared goal, and that is development. And also that BRICS is reformist, and there's a lot of debate on where BRICS lays on these. And my thinking, my understanding is that BRICS is reformist. It's reformist particularly in getting to understand that BRICS doesn't want to ghettoize itself. It doesn't want to create its own ghetto of global south development institutions, but realizes that it is part of the central fabric, central core of international institutional systems. And this has been reflected in all the declarations of the BRICS summits. And this is so because the BRICS countries, they emanate from different regions. And as they emanate from different regions, they have different political, regional security concerns. And these regional security concerns, they are all entwined, they are all tied up within the centrality of the United Nations system and the centrality of the international relations system. And so they cannot therefore be but reformist. Hence the last point that BRICS, it continues to urge for pro-global south institutional reforms. It is just that this has taken such a significant momentum because BRICS constitutes close to just over 40% of the world's population, and also with the Eurozone financial crisis, this has created a whole lot of sensationalization on the potency of BRICS. But that notwithstanding, BRICS is a reformist constellation of countries, and it's reformist in that respect. And the main concern of this presentation is to try and link peace, security, and sustainable development. And we have to then track the mandate of BRICS from the time that they were formed as an institution. And through tracking the mandate, we realize that BRICS has always acknowledged how peace, security, and sustainable development are intertwined. And this has been, as I've stated before, this has been reflected in all the BRICS summit declarations. But despite that, the challenge then is that despite the fact that these have been reflected, but it ends there. There is no sense of trying to think on the practicalities on how to realize, on how to actualize these linkages between peace, security, and development. And indeed, there is a temptation, I would say, from the way that the new development bank is setting itself up, a temptation to proceed as traditional, a temptation to proceed as traditional in the sense of how the other multilateral banks from the global south, from South America, for instance, from Asia, how they've staked their claim on sustainable development. And that is, we merely end at funding infrastructure development, funding social welfare development, and then any other forms of challenges, particularly from peace and security challenges, we will only deal with them once there's a cessation of hostilities. We'll only deal with them once we see that now that the dust has settled down, we can then proceed and ask people, what do you need in your area? What community, environmental, institutional needs do you require? And then we proceed from there. So there's that temptation then. And so this is one of the reasons why we have this presentation, is to get to is to gear ourselves up to try and think differently on how the new development bank and BRICS can approach this development. can approach the linkages between peace, security, and development. And the last part of this slide, it will lead us to the second slide, that every year BRICS countries, they always reach a consensus on peace and security, challenges. But if we really face the reality, that these are all, as I've pointed out there, but if we face reality, there is a distinction between hard peace and security challenges and soft ones, or peace building ones. And really, if we face reality, we realize that as BRICS Academic Forum and as scholars, we do not really have the reach to advise, have the reach really to have, or the adequate reach to advise the BRICS Ministerial Foreign Ministers Forum on what they can do on these hard peace and security challenges, like terrorism, for instance. And so therefore we have to face reality as to in what way can we then make sustainable contribution, sustainable and substantial contribution as scholars, as researchers, as part of the BRICS Academic Forum. In what way can we make realistic, sustainable and substantive contributions towards peace and security challenges that can then be tackled from our level. And so this is why that I point out that we need to discern what to advise BRICS countries on peace and security challenges, and that hard peace and security challenges are prerogatives of BRICS national and foreign policy interests. Because as I've pointed out earlier on, BRICS countries, they come from different regional backgrounds. We as South Africa, we come from a SADC background, and we tend to be quite protective of what we would want to discuss and not project these to the international forum, but rather discuss them within SADC. And also, we carry forward Southern Africa and the African continent to other international regional economic communities. Certain peace and security challenges would rather at the prerogatives of these regional economic communities. And so we have to then discern what is realistic and what we can contribute to towards these peace and security challenges. And so I continue there and say that we should rather settle for the so-called soft peace building issues, and that going back to how inextricably linked peace, security, and development, it is much easier and it is much more realistic when we link peace, security, and development at a peace building level. And I continue and to quote there the quotes from the Enlarger Freedom report, UN report, and from former AU chairperson Jean Ping. But what is also important is that some of the peace building focus areas, as I've listed there, 4 of them, the rebuilding of infrastructure, and that these tend to be the prerogative, for instance, of China and Brazil. Protection of human rights, South Africa, India, and Brazil. Reconstitution of individual identities, South Africa, India, and the reforging of individual and community relationships. Now, this is a constellation of peace building focus areas that the BRICS countries tend to focus on. Now, the rationale behind
Sorry, can I just interrupt you briefly? Moses, could you just look at the slides? They're not coming through on our side. Possibly Durban is affected as well.
slides.
Is it?
Okay, thank you. It's on its way through.
Thank you.
Okay. As I've pointed out, that the rationale for putting out these peace building focus areas of the BRICS countries is to descend from the constellation of these peace building focus areas and descend areas where the development agencies of the different BRICS countries, where they can coalesce, where they can get together and share peace building focus areas, working with the new development bank. And I then proceed to look at what I would refer to as the launch pad of the linkages between peace, security, and development. And the rationale behind this is that the Africa Regional Center of the new development bank will be based here. And so therefore it is quite then logical to have to put South Africa as the link, as the launch pad of these linkages. And that the reason why this sounds quite logical is that firstly, that South Africa links BRICS' interests on peace and security in Africa through its foreign policy ethos on internationalism, Pan-Africanism, South-South cooperation, and its position as a gateway to Africa, the African agenda, and its experience and interest on peacemaking and peace building in Africa. And that South Africa also has an extensive reach on a whole range of African and international institutions. And so therefore, these are the reasons why I think that it would be quite logical to have a theoretical or a conceptual sound, a conceptual launch pad for the linkages between peace, security, challenges, and development in Africa. And so, moving on to the new development bank in particularly, and how it could fund the practicalities of finding and funding the nexus between peace, security, and development. Firstly, we do realize from the mandate of the new development bank that it wants to, quote, mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development. And now our thinking is to forge the thinking on peace and security challenges within that, is to basically extend the thinking of sustainable development, moving it beyond the thinking of infrastructure development, but to capture peace and security challenges, and as I've pointed out, not from the tail end of conflict, but during conflict, before the cessation of hostilities, if I may put it that way. And the need for the new development bank to fund the link between peace, security, and development has been elevated because of the volume of South-South trade in the world, which has increased. And the space also for the new development bank has become more obvious because of the so-called infrastructure development gap in developing countries, which has gone beyond the capacity of the World Bank, the capacity of the IMF. And so, in a sense, then, to that effect, the new development bank loans could potentially dwarf World Bank loans, as in the CAF, which now funds more development projects in Latin America than the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined. And so, therefore, there's a huge potential for the new development bank to execute sustainable development in the global south. But we also have to look at the environment of development assistance, the environment of aid funding, the environment of donor funding that the new development is entering in. It's getting into this environment which is quite complex at this stage. You have an increase or a multiplication of actors and the multiplication of actors, and particularly from the global south, you now do not necessarily have that traditional donor-recipient divide. Now it's becoming a bit unclear, because you have a whole lot of countries from the global south that are emerging as donors, and some emerging as both donors and recipients. And so you have a multiplication of actors. And also, particularly within the peace building section, the United Nations, it has pointedly expressed that its capacity on delivering on peace building, particularly, let's say, in areas such as transnational organized crime, for instance, is being reduced. And so it is calling for cross-sectoral engagement with a whole lot of multilateral organizations, and in particularly NGOs. And so NGOs that should reach out and work with the United Nations, work with other multilateral institutions, because of this reduction of capacity, this reduction of reach. And so the new development bank enters into that area where you have a whole lot of stakeholders, whole lot of agents, and so as BRICS has stated in its declarations, BRICS works within an environment where there's an existence, and where there's an existence of various agents and various multilateral institutions. And so the new development bank enters then into that arena, and is willing to work with all sorts of stakeholders and institutions. And so what I've done here is that what I've done here is that I've come up with a typology of different BRICS countries development agencies, the characteristics of these development agencies, and what forms of convex points that these development agencies could then work together. For Brazil, we have the APC. For Russia, it's developing towards the Russian aid. And as I've pointed out, it's mainly working through bilateral cooperation based on technical transfer of expertise. And the main traditional areas of development are energy and infrastructure development. And India, it's working with, it has come up with the Development Administration Partnership, which streamlines and complements the Indian Technical Economic Cooperation. And much of its focus at this stage is on the e-network, or the Pan-African e-network, which tries basically to link up via satellite technology, offline and online, with African medical institutions and other technical institutions. And then there's China, and I will go in detail on those. These are basically the ways in which the different development agencies from the different BRICS countries, the way they've been operating, and the way they've been traditionally operating in directing funds towards companies and towards institutions from their countries, directing funds either through bilateral aid or through trilateral cooperation with different countries. And so this is just a layout in trying to get us to think how the new development bank can coalesce these different development agencies in working together. And what I did is that I've then come up with descriptions of the different development agencies from the different BRICS countries, and in particular how they've been traditionally working in dispersing funds and in dispersing technical expertise to different countries in Africa and elsewhere. And Brazil has particularly been working with about 37 African countries, but mainly with Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa, and has been mainly focusing on agriculture and tropical medicine. Agriculture, including the bioenergy production, and these are the main traditional areas of concern. And so, and particularly has been working currently in Angola and in Mozambique. And it also works with different international health agencies and institutions. And then with Russia at this stage, its forms of disbursements to and technical expertise to Africa is quite limited at this stage. It mainly focuses, as I've pointed out, on infrastructure development, which is streamlined towards energy. And then with India, as I've pointed out before, those are the statistics. It's mainly focusing on ICT development and how ICT development then links to human resources development, agricultural development, and medical technology. And then China mainly focuses on infrastructure and social welfare development. And as I've pointed out there, you have different forms of funding for infrastructure, the grant schemes, the interest-free loans, etc. And then South Africa has different development agencies. The South African Development Partnership, the Southern African Development Partnership Agency, is in the process of formation as we are speaking at this stage. It has evolved from the African Renaissance Fund, and it will be set up within DECO. And then we have the DPSA, the Industrial Development Corporation, and the Export Credit Insurance Corporation of South Africa. And now, although South Africa provides those amounts of money, but it has learned from the experiences of it has generated from the African Renaissance Fund that it is better to forge trilateral corporations and mainly move with the transfer of technical expertise through technical cooperation, trilateral technical corporations. And so at this stage, although the SATPA bill has been formed, and but as I've pointed out, that SATPA is in the process of formation. And so what we've done then is that after I've listed out all of these and the typology of the different development agencies, the purpose of all of these is to get us to think on how the new development bank can then coalesce the different development agencies and try to get them to work together, particularly within the area of peace and security challenges, and generating these challenges, generating sustainable development challenges out of these. So what I've done is that I've come up with a fictitious account of typology, in a sense of on how basically we can proceed, a kind of typology on how we can proceed in identifying how different development agencies from the different BRICS countries can then work together. For instance, on the DRC, grading that as grade 2 conflict, that is a post-conflict but unstable with regional effects and issues identified. For instance, I repeat that this is something that I came up with to try and get our minds to think on how the different development agencies of the BRICS countries can work together. That the issues identified would be demobilization, DDR in Eastern DRC, resettlement of refugees, education and advocacy on land tenure systems, land rights, agricultural productions, and exploration of potential agribusiness bioenergy production in Eastern DRC. And I've listed all of those. And that the BRICS countries which are affected or could be potentially affected or interested. Brazil, South Cooperation on Agriculture, Bioenergy Production, South Africa, Youth and Women, Education, Mobilization, India, Exploration of ICT Development, Employment Creation Potential, particularly targeting youth, and that the stakeholders affected or interested, the Southern African Development Partnership Agency, working with the Brazilian and the Indian agency, and that the mechanism that could be used, depending on the mechanism that that the new development bank would come up with, could be, for instance, guarantees to SADPA. And 5 years at the time frame could be 5 years or less. And so what I've done is that I did the same to extended this to three more countries: South Sudan, Somalia, and Angola, in just trying to get us to think on how to actualize these linkages between the different development agencies. And so, yeah. In conclusion, I go back to what I had said at the beginning, that this is tabula rasa, and so we are trying to get our minds to think together. And so what is clear at this stage is that we have to, we need to relate with other stakeholders, because you have a whole lot of stakeholders in Africa, from non-governmental level, governmental level, to multilateral levels. And they've always, in the past, as I've said, that the new development bank, it joins other multilateral development banks and development agencies in a continuum of history of multilateral banks from the global south executing sustainable development. And these multilateral banks, they are still there, they are still in existence, perhaps in a reduced capacity, perhaps not. But the point that I'm making is that they are there, and that the new development bank can glean experience from them, and not only experience, but working relations. And so with these multiplied actors and stakeholders on the ground, the new development bank needs to coordinate developmental activities with them. And the other problem with multilateral development agencies and banks and NGOs is that they tend to leave development projects hanging without measured development outcomes. And so this is what the new development bank also needs to work on. That'll be the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suisa. I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We'll take about 3 questions and then hand it back to you to provide some answers. Victoria?
Are there any questions here? Have you got a question?
Yes, I do.
There's one. Just introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, I'm Komoto Ramushu from University of Pretoria and the NIHSS as well. I just wanted to ask Dr. Suisa about if you think that room is given enough, because you spoke about a cross-sectional approach, particularly to soft peace-building interests or concerns. And I'm thinking about issues that are shared by, particularly if you look at issues of gender-based violence, of high rape rates, of, which is a real, genuine and valid security concern in South Africa, in Brazil, in India, where we see, women basically living in fear, for instance. We even have, in terms of social movements you're speaking about, extractive industries, we have an Americana situation in South Africa. People in India also fighting issues of extraction, biofuels in Brazil, that kind of thing. So my question is basically, do you think that there has really meaningfully within the BRICS been engagement by heads of states with the people who are working on the ground to sort of enhance soft security?
Thank you. Are there any other questions in Pretoria? Durban, would you like to say anything? Sorry, we can't hear you.
There we are. How's that? Okay. Yes, I'm Patrick Bond, Center for Civil Society. I actually have 15 questions. That's too many. would I be allowed to pop 6 about just the very first area of very extreme controversy? Would that be all right? 6 about the IMF, really, because it said that this is a reform-oriented BRICS in relation to the IMF. Could I just ask, I really appreciate the paper and the spirit of bringing in all the stakeholders. Actually, in Durban, I only had some stale sandwiches. Maybe you guys have the steaks. Maybe that's going to inform my bitter, angry left-wing comments here. First, when Trevor Manuel arranged a $750 billion capitalization with BRICS support for the IMF, it was April 1, 2009. Unfortunately, April 1, it wasn't a joke. What was the conditionality? I mean, did we really want to reform, or did we want to amplify what the IMF does? And that brings us to the second. When, in 2012, BRICS gave $75 billion to the IMF for recapitalization, is it true that the only recorded conditionality on that money, on MoneyWeb, you can check it out, was Pravin Gordon, and he asked the IMF to be more nasty to the global south, specifically to the people like of Ireland, where I was born. I guess I'm wondering, is that a qualification, does that qualify as reform? For the 2010 reform specifically, who wins and who loses if the 2010 reform is finally approved by the US Congress? Isn't it the case that the BRICS get 20% more voting power, but every other country in Africa loses? How is that a reform? Isn't that an amplification of what's wrong with the IMF? And then when we think about the kind of guys that we send to the IMF, people like the people we send to the BRICS New Development Bank, Tito Mboweni, Leslie Masdorf, people who mainly come recently from Goldman Sachs. Would that be a difference in the way the IMF would be run? Have they ever expressed any objection to the kind of IMF policies? And fifth, isn't the contingent reserve arrangement, the $100 billion fund that is meant to be basically an alternative to the IMF, as advertised, doesn't it force a country, say like South Africa, after we borrow just $3 billion, our quota is $10 billion, to go to the IMF to get a structural adjustment policy? And finally, when there was a chance to change the leadership of the IMF, which was 2011, there was a guy who kept having Viagra overdoses, I think that was Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and he was replaced by a fellow corrupt French finance minister, Christine Lagarde. And what did the BRICS do? Because they had an alternative, right? A Mexican central banker was proposed. So in those 6 questions, that's double my quota here for Durban, I'm sorry, aren't you needing to rethink whether this is reform or deform? Doesn't this amplify the worst neoliberal and imperialist characteristics of what the IMF does? I'll stop there, but I do have a few more for the NDB if we can get around to them. Thanks.
Dr. Switzer, would you like to respond to those?
Okay. Thank you. Let me begin. Let me start with Khomuzo's question on cross-sectoral engagement. The issue of cross-sectoral engagement, it really came about from as I've pointed out, the UN's cry or the UN's call to say basically that that there's too much on our plate and that we therefore need to decentralize the stakeholders and decentralize the stakeholders' entry into as agents into how we can deal with all sorts of these issues, because some of the issues are quite localized to the extent that it is quite difficult to stagger the different contributions. And for instance, the issue of gender-based violence, the UN Women, what it has done recently is that it has worked with the UNFPA, for instance, and working with the UNFPA has called on the traditional leaders and traditional institutions and local government institutions in South Africa, particularly to reach rural areas, because these are institutions and these are people who are at the cold face of all forms of gender-based violence and gender-based issues. And so what I'm then saying then is that at this cross-sectoral engagement level, the National Development Bank can also enter this sector using the platform of peace and security challenges in different African countries, where they form the core part of peace and security challenges, and how they also form the core part in generating sustainable development opportunities from these peace and security challenges. And of course, the new development bank would then work with the different NGOs and other institutions and stakeholders on the ground. And that would form part of what has always been the goal, and that is localizing ownership of action of agencies at the local level. And then going back to the gist of Professor Bond's question, that what I meant when I said that BRICS is reformist is that from the debate of whether BRICS is radical or reformist, it is reformist in the sense that it is leaning more not towards ghettoizing or a radical form of shifting the global south from the traditional or the conventional forms of thinking and organization of international institutions, but rather not to shy away or not to move away from what has already been set up institutionally, what has already been set up traditionally, because the global south, as much as the global south is complains about the international institution, but it is also an integral part of these international institutions. It is also part of the United Nations, and doesn't want really to radically reform the United Nations, although it realizes that it is quite a feat to get into the United Nations Security Council in a way that it deems fit. And so therefore, it doesn't really want to rock the boat, if I may put it that way. And so it is reformist in that sense, as is reformist versus radical. It is not radical, but reformist in that sense. And also all of these questions then about who wins, who loses, so that they're really taken care of, they're really answered, because as I've pointed out, that BRICS is reformist in that sense, reformist as not in being radical.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on to another round of questions, I'd just like to note, firstly, we have about 6 minutes or so before our time is up, so we'll just be brief on the next round of questions. The next issue, we've had about 10 viewers online who have been watching. I got a note from someone from SIRE just to thank us for the event. We've also noted that there's going to be about 20 of the contestants from the BRICS Youth Contest are actually going to be following this event, and they might want to actually send some questions after the event is over. So probably as you wrap up, Dr. Suisa, you can just provide some contact details on how we can get in touch with you. Durban, would you like to add something? And then Pretoria?
It would be terribly unfair if I took up 5.5 of the 6 minutes, so I'm just going to email my 9 questions about the MDB, if that's fair. But I had a very quick follow-up question. Given the response to the argument that IMF, we think of as international financial imperialism, is now being reformed, seat at the table for the BRICS, would you agree that we could therefore call the BRICS in this relationship a sub-imperialist? That's my quick question.
Anything further in Pretoria?
No, there's nothing here.
Okay, you can go ahead, Dr. Suisa.
I think it would be quite unfair to call BRICS southern imperialist, if I got that, because
it's sub-SUB, sub-imperialist, working within, reforming from within, but actually amplifying the negative characteristics by being the deputy sheriff. That's the theory that we're using in our new book about BRICS, sub-imperialist. Just in the way you described, being part of, not against.
Well, at this stage, I would say that they're not sub-imperialist, but they do not want to rock the boat in the sense that they are still trying to reform from within, and then after that, taking it further. And as we see also that the European Union and other global North multilateral institutions, they really want to engage with BRICS on a more, I would say, conciliatory note. So I wouldn't say that at this stage it's sub-imperialist, but I would say it's quite careful form of negotiating with the global South in multilateral institutions, but not at the same time rocking the boat. So it's moving away from sub-imperialism, but not that far really. So it's still a process that is proceeding.
Okay. All right. Well, shall I just say we welcome the work that you are doing, Dr. Suisa, as the BRICS Bank is beginning to try to operationalize its activities next year. We think it's very valuable for us to be producing this type of research and just adding to the debate. These are the issues that need to be surfaced. These are the things we need to talk about. We don't want to appear silent, that we have no opinions on how the bank should be run. So these are things we want to be discussed in these type of forums. If there's nothing further from anyone, I would just like to thank you all for coming through. And Dr. Suisa, could we just have your contact details one last time?
Okay, my email address is small cases BUNTU, my first name, 0802@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you everyone. If you've got any other questions, you could then email it through to Dr. Suisa. Thank you, sir, for coming through. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you, everyone. I declare the session closed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very much.
Sorry, I didn't ask if you. Oh, perfect. I can talk.
The research student.
Yes.
My name is Mrs. In order to communicate with Dr. Selisa, it's going to be easy for us to send an email explaining yourself and
Okay, no, perfect. You can just keep us in touch with us. Let me just deal with this laptop.